The sky over Frederick was still bruised with the color of deep night. At 5:27 a.m., the driveway remained empty, save for the hum of an engine struggling against the silence. Chris Watts backed his truck toward the garage door. He moved with a rhythm that lacked any sign of hesitation, his hands steady on the wheel as he aligned the vehicle. Every motion was precise, calculated, and devoid of tremor. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, and walked to the garage. The house held no light. It stood as a dark, impenetrable block against the horizon. He moved between the garage and the truck bed in a steady, rhythmic cycle, carrying the weight of his actions without pause. He stopped once, glancing toward the neighboring houses. The street was still, no curtains moved, no porch lights flickered. He returned to the truck, locked the tailgate, and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine idled, a low, rhythmic vibration that cut through the stillness of the morning. He did not look back at the front door. He shifted the truck into gear, his movements as fluid as if he were leaving for a routine workday, and began to roll away from the house. The suburban streetlights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the encroaching shadows of the open road. Chris drove north, the truck tires humming against the asphalt with a hypnotic, steady drone. For 60 minutes, the landscape shifted from quiet residential blocks to the sprawling, desolate plains of Colorado. Outside, the world was a void of muted colors and flat horizons. No other vehicles shared the road. No lights flickered in the distance to offer a sense of life. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick, stagnant, and heavy. He kept his eyes fixed forward, his grip on the steering wheel unchanging, navigating the dark arteries of the state with the same clinical precision he had shown at home. As he turned onto the dirt track leading to the oil site, the road surface turned to loose gravel, rattling against the undercarriage. The vastness of the plains pressed in on every side, swallowing the sound of the engine. He reached the gate, the metal frame looming against the pre-dawn sky, and stopped. He sat for a moment, the only living presence in a landscape that had become a graveyard of earth and industry. The isolation was absolute. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Chris stepped out into the biting morning air. He worked with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. He dragged Shanann from the truck bed toward a patch of disturbed earth, his movements devoid of hesitation or strain. He dug a shallow grave, the sound of the shovel biting into the hard, dry soil the only noise for miles. Once the earth was leveled, he turned back to the vehicle. He reached for the young girls, his actions precise as he moved them toward the crude oil tanks. The openings were narrow, barely 8 inches across. He pushed, forcing them through the steel apertures with a focused, steady pressure. He did not rush. He did not look away. When the final tank was sealed, he stood in the center of the site, his breathing rhythmic and controlled. He scanned the horizon, checking the perimeter one last time. There was no trace of what had just occurred. The site stood as it had before a collection of rusted pipes and humming equipment. He walked back to the truck, wiped his hands on his trousers, and climbed behind the wheel. The sun began to bleed over the edge of the world, illuminating nothing but the empty plains. The truck rolled into the driveway just as the neighborhood began to stir. Chris cut the engine, the sudden quiet marking the start of his new performance. He climbed out, adjusted his stance, and walked toward the front door with a deliberate, measured gait. Inside, he moved with the same methodical focus, ensuring the house appeared untouched, undisturbed, and waiting. Hours later, he stood on his front porch. The morning light was bright, catching the lines of his face as he faced a cluster of reporters. He leaned into the microphone, his posture slumped just enough to mimic exhaustion. "I just want them back," he said, his voice level and devoid of tremor. He spoke the words to the cameras, his hands resting on the porch railing without a shake. His eyes remained fixed and dry, never once reddening or darting away. He held his position, waiting for the cameras to capture the image of a man shattered by loss. The neighbors watched from their lawns, observing a man who looked exactly as he should, yet moved with a rhythmic, calculated stillness that defied the tragedy he claimed to be suffering. He offered no tears, only the rehearsed lines of a man who had already moved on. The performance held for the cameras, but it failed to account for the digital eye of the neighborhood. Investigators arrived, their focus shifting from the man on the porch to the data left behind in the quiet of the morning. They moved through the street, collecting hardware and mapping the digital footprints of every house. A neighbor's security camera, mounted high on a nearby wall, held the first crack in the wall. The footage was granular, a grainy loop of the driveway at dawn. It captured the truck backing out, the reverse lights cutting through the darkness at exactly 5:27 a.m. The timestamp appeared on the screen, a cold, unyielding number that pinned the event to a specific second. It was the first piece of objective truth in a landscape of fabricated words. No one left the house after that time. The timeline Chris had constructed began to dissolve under the weight of the recording. He remained on the porch, unaware that the footage was already being processed, cataloged, and pinned against his own statements. The trap was closing, dictated not by human intuition, but by the silent, unblinking lens that had recorded the departure he believed no one would ever see. The investigation moved inside the house. Officers stepped through the front door, their movements slow and systematic. The air inside was still, the quiet, heavy, and dense. They began the walkthrough, checking every room, every corner, looking for any sign of a hasty departure. In the master bedroom, they found the items that should have been gone if a mother had simply walked away. Her phone sat on the nightstand, screens dark and silent. Her keys rested on the kitchen counter, catching the morning light. Her purse remained in the closet, undisturbed. These were not the possessions of a woman who had left on her own terms. The lead investigator signaled his team, his expression hardening as he scanned the surfaces. He noted the lack of luggage, the absence of packed clothes, and the presence of daily necessities left behind. The tone of the room changed instantly. What began as a missing person report transformed into a cold, sterile search for evidence of a struggle. They began to mark the floor, taping off doorways and sealing the entry points. Every object left in place became a silent witness to a reality that was no longer hidden. The house was not empty because she had left. It was empty because she had been taken. The investigation shifted from the physical rooms of the house to the digital expanse of his phone. Investigators secured the device, scrolling through a timeline of messages that existed beneath his public veneer. The screen glowed with the text of a secret life. They found the messages to Nickel Kessinger, a string of digital breadcrumbs that led directly away from his family. The content was unmistakable, each line stripped away the carefully curated image of a devoted husband and father. He was not the man he presented to the cameras or the neighbors. He was a man building a future that had no space for the people he claimed to be searching for. The revelation acted as a sledgehammer against his narrative. Every word he had spoken in the media was now framed by this hidden connection. The motive crystallized in the cold light of the data. His domestic life was not a sanctuary, but a burden he had calculated how to discard. The investigators sat in silence, reading the exchanges, watching the facade of the family man dissolve into the reality of a man seeking a clean slate. The affair was no longer a secret. It was the sharp, jagged edge of the motive that tied everything together. The investigation accelerated as forensic teams pulled the location logs from his mobile device. The screen displayed a map, a series of pings tracing his movements during the early morning hours of August 13. While he claimed to be at work, the data told a different story. The device had traveled far beyond the designated job site, heading instead to a remote, desolate patch of land. Investigators cross-referenced the coordinates. They identified the specific oil field where his truck had sat idling for nearly an hour. The digital trail was precise, mapping his path with undeniable accuracy. Every turn he took, every minute he spent in that isolated location was now documented and stored. The pings acted like a tightening noose, pulling the reality of his actions into sharp focus. There was no room for error, no way to explain away the signal that placed him exactly where the tragedy had unfolded. The investigators sat back, watching the map display the path of his deception. The digital breadcrumbs had led them out of the house and into the heart of the crime scene. The distance between his claims and the truth had vanished. The trap was set, and the evidence now dictated his every next move. The investigation moved from the digital sphere to the physical confines of the police station. An investigator motioned toward a heavy metal door. Chris walked forward, his pace steady, his movements deliberate. He entered the room and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing the space with a metallic finality. The room was small, windowless, and painted a neutral, abrasive gray. A single table occupied the center, bolted firmly to the floor. Two chairs sat on opposite sides, The air felt thin, recycled, and stagnant. There were no distractions, no outlets, and no way to look away from the person sitting across the table. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, persistent frequency that filled the silence. Chris took his seat. He placed his hands flat on the cold laminate surface. He stared at the wall, his posture rigid, shoulders squared against the back of the chair. The transition was absolute. Outside, the world continued, but in this box, time stalled. The investigators filed in, their presence heavy, their movements methodical. The interrogation had begun. The psychological battleground was defined, and the room itself functioned as a pressure cooker, preparing to squeeze the truth from a man who had spent days carefully constructing a lie. The lead investigator placed a heavy black case on the table. He clicked the latches open, revealing the polygraph equipment. He began laying out the components with systematic care. Chris watched the wires being uncoiled, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the technician's hands. The investigator explained the process in a flat, clinical tone. He spoke of sensors, heart rate variability, and the necessity of establishing a baseline. Chris nodded, his movements measured, his expression carefully neutral. He held his arms steady as the straps were tightened around his chest, and the blood pressure cuff was secured to his upper arm. His breathing remained shallow and consistent. Small sensors were attached to his fingertips, the adhesive pulling slightly at the skin. He sat motionless, the wires trailing from his body like thin, black veins connected to the box. The investigator checked the connections, adjusting the tension of the straps until they were snug against his frame. The room grew quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of the machine as it initialized. Chris stared ahead, his hands resting on his thighs, fingers uncurling. The final preparations were complete. The device was active, waiting for the first question to break the stillness of the room. The test began with mundane queries. Is your name Chris? Do you live in Colorado? The machine responded with a rhythmic, steady hiss. Every answer was delivered in a flat, monotone cadence. Chris remained fixed in his chair, his eyes tracking the needle as it traced lines across the paper. The investigator shifted his position, leaning forward until his face entered Chris's peripheral vision. The line of questioning sharpened. The pace accelerated. Each inquiry hit the room with the force of an indictment. The machine responded, its internal gears whirring, the paper feeding through the slot with a persistent dry sound. Chris did not blink. He kept his heels pressed against the floor, his muscles locked in a static, rigid posture. The room felt smaller with every passing second. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of the questions and the mechanical, unforgiving feedback of the sensors. He was no longer just speaking to a man, he was answering to the machine. He gripped the edge of his seat, knuckles white, as the investigator repeated his inquiries with a cold, relentless precision. The silence between the questions stretched thin, snapping like a wire under extreme tension. Every tick of the clock echoed against the walls, marking the agonizing passage of a test that refused to let him go. The investigator leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate register. He bypassed the routine and asked the question that hung in the center of the room. Chris opened his mouth to answer, but his throat tightened. Before the word left his lips, the machine erupted. The needle surged upward, a jagged, violent stroke that tore through the paper feed. It did not settle. It spiked again, a frantic rhythm that betrayed the stillness of his body. The machine let out a sharp, discordant beep. The investigator stopped the scroll and pulled the paper free. He laid it flat on the desk, pointing a finger at the erratic, blackened zigzags. "Look at this, Chris," he said. The room went cold. The mask of calm Chris had worn for hours began to slide. His shoulders, previously squared and rigid, dropped forward. The air left his lungs in a ragged, audible exhale. He stared at the paper, then down at his own trembling hands. The mechanical hum of the machine ceased, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. He sank deeper into the chair, his spine bowing, his gaze fixed on the floor. The deception was no longer a secret. The evidence was absolute, and he was finally, visibly defeated. The interrogation room felt suffocating. Chris remained hunched, his chin resting near his chest, his eyes refusing to meet the investigator. The silence stretched until he finally shifted, his voice barely a rasp. "I need to talk to my father," he whispered. His hands fumbled with the edges of his seat, gripping the fabric until his knuckles turned pale. When the door opened and his father entered, Chris did not look up immediately. He waited until the chair scraped against the floor. Then, he leaned forward, his entire frame collapsing further as if the weight of his own existence had become physical. He began to speak, his words stumbling over one another. He admitted to the act, his voice gaining a hollow strength as he constructed the narrative he hoped would save him. "I killed her," he muttered, but his head snapped up, his eyes darting toward his father. He pointed a finger, not at himself, but toward the memory of his wife. He claimed she was the one who had harmed their children, painting her as the architect of the tragedy. He leaned into the lie, his shoulders hunched, his face twisted in a mask of manufactured grief. He was trading her memory for his own survival, pouring the poison of his deceit into the room. The lead investigator did not blink. He leaned across the metal table, his shadow stretching over the confession Chris had just poured out. "That is not the truth, Chris," he said. The room grew tight. The investigator pulled a file from his folder and dropped it onto the table. It was not a question. It was a rebuttal. He pointed to the data, a sequence of timestamps and digital footprints that shattered the timeline Chris had invented. The forensics were clear. The movements, the phone records, and the physical reality of the house that morning made his story impossible. Chris went still. The lie had been his last defense, and it was crumbling under the weight of the evidence. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The investigator tapped the paper again, his eyes locking onto Chris, demanding a reality he could no longer manipulate. There was no hesitation in the detective's movements. Every piece of evidence presented was a brick being removed from the wall Chris had built to hide his actions. He looked at the floor, then at his own hands, realizing the trap had closed. The narrative he had spent hours weaving was now nothing more than scrap paper. He was no longer the victim of a tragedy. He was the sole architect of it. The investigators watched, waiting for the final collapse. The search teams arrived at the remote oil field as the sun climbed high, baking the dry dirt into a fine, choking dust. There was no sound here but the distant hum of machinery and the rhythmic metallic clank of the tanks. The investigators stepped out, their boots sinking into the grit. They approached the crude oil site, the air thick with the pungent, heavy odor of petroleum that clung to everything it touched. They moved toward the tall, cylindrical storage units. A technician climbed the ladder, his face set in a grim, immovable line. He peered into the 8-inch hatch, his light cutting through the dark, viscous liquid below. The recovery was a slow, technical nightmare. They worked in silence, their movements precise and heavy with the weight of the task. They had to navigate the narrow openings, pulling back what had been hidden in the black sludge. Every motion was deliberate, measured against the horrific context of the site. When they finally cleared the tanks, the reality of the scene took hold. It was not a place for words. It was a site of mechanical cruelty. The team stood back, their work done. The truth now physically manifest in the harsh daylight. The recovery was complete, and the silence that followed was absolute. The news broke in waves. It started with a notification on a screen, then a headline, then a collective gasp that rippled through the streets of Frederick. Neighbors who had stood on their porches during the initial search now retreated behind locked doors, the air thick with a sudden, sharp realization. The facts were no longer rumors. The police confirmed the recovery, and the sheer scale of the depravity hit the public consciousness like a physical blow. People gathered at the edge of the property, leaving stuffed animals and flowers in the grass, their faces tight with a mixture of confusion and raw fury. Every detail released the oil tanks, the timing, the cold precision eroded the last remnants of the man they thought they knew. The house sat silent, its windows reflecting the growing crowd and the flashing lights of news vans. Inside, the quiet was heavy, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The community turned, their empathy for the lost family hardening into a singular, sharp demand for justice. The public image of a grieving father disintegrated, replaced by the grim reality of a calculated monster. The outrage was not a fleeting moment. It was a permanent shift in the town's history, a deep, jagged fracture that would not heal. Months passed within the concrete walls of the prison. The investigators were finished, but the perpetrator was not. He began to write, his handwriting steady, the letters flowing out in long, descriptive lines. He detailed weeks of preparation that preceded the final night. He admitted to slipping OxyContin into his wife's water, a deliberate attempt to end her pregnancy long before the house in Frederick went silent. The words on the page stripped away the last veneer of a sudden, impulsive rage. He laid out the timeline of a man who viewed his family as an obstacle to a secret life. He did not describe a moment of weakness or a loss of control. He described a plan. He wrote about the logistics of starting over, the calculated steps taken to ensure the house would be empty and the path clear. Each sentence was a cold, logical account of a life traded for a new beginning. The letters confirmed what the physical evidence had only hinted at. The events were not a desperate collapse, but a measured, long-term construction of an ending. The revelation of this intent destroyed any lingering doubt. The mask was gone. The man who had spoken to the cameras with steady hands was the same man who had mapped out the destruction of his own family weeks in advance. The courtroom in Weld County filled with a heavy, stifling silence on the 6th of November 2018. The legal process that had dragged through months of investigation and discovery finally reached its terminus. Chris stood before the bench, his movements slow and deliberate, stripped of the bravado he had shown in the early days of the search. He entered his guilty plea, the words cutting through the air of the crowded room. There were no more excuses, no more shifts of blame, and no more attempts to rewrite the events of that night. The judge addressed the court, noting the gravity of the crimes and the permanence of the loss. The sentence was read, 5 life terms, delivered with a precision that matched the scale of the destruction. There was no room for parole, no possibility of a future outside the prison walls. The gavel struck, a sharp, final sound that signaled the end of the legal proceedings. The case was closed, leaving behind only the cold record of a man who had ended 4 lives to claim his own freedom. The courtroom cleared, but the weight of the verdict remained, a permanent mark on the history of the town. For the family members who had sat in the front rows, the legal system had provided its answer, yet the silence of the victims remained absolute. The state of Wisconsin received him with heavy steel doors and the constant hum of industrial security. He was moved from the local jail to a high-security facility, processed through the machinery of the penal system, and assigned a number. His world shrank to the dimensions of a concrete cell, lit by the flicker of fluorescent tubes that never dimmed. The transition was absolute. There were no more news cameras, no more interviews, and no more attempts to negotiate the narrative. His day began with the sound of a locking mechanism sliding home and ended with the same. He spent his hours in the silence of a structure built to hold human beings away from the world. The life he had calculated for himself, the one free of family ties and domestic responsibility, had arrived. But it was nothing like the version he had imagined. It was a life of measured steps, regulated meals, and the crushing repetition of a cell block. He remained there, a ghost in a system that would not release him, while the world outside continued to rotate without him. The quiet of the prison was total, a permanent enclosure that reflected the permanence of his actions. Every wall was a barrier, every corridor a reminder of the path he had chosen, and every night was identical to the one before it. In Frederick, the house stands quiet. The lawn remains trimmed, but the windows reflect nothing but the movement of the clouds. Inside, the rooms are devoid of sound. No toys scatter across the carpet. No voices carry through the hallways. The kitchen counter remains clear, a surface that once held the routine of a family morning, now just a slab of stone in a cold, stagnant space. Dust settles on the surfaces, undisturbed by the rhythm of daily life that once defined these walls. The bedrooms sit with doors left open, revealing only the stillness of empty beds and the fading scent of a home that stopped functioning in the early hours of August 13. The neighborhood continues its cycle. Cars pass by, and the sun rises and sets, but the property remains a silent landmark. It is a structure of wood and drywall that holds the weight of a missing presence. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child are absent from every corner. The house stands as a record of a life traded for a secret, a testament to a family that was erased in a single night. The silence here is not just an absence of noise, but a permanent reminder of a total, irreversible loss.